research that for a period of repentance on that, like around...
My conversation with you is going to be a little different. Although American policy is, of course, an important topic, I'd like to talk a little bit about the cultural and religious sources of the shape of American foreign policy toward the Islamic world, and specifically Israel and Palestine. We can discover the religious sources of our policy if we look back into the religiously informed sources of our U.S. identity. Now, that process of looking back into our identity causes us to ask difficult questions of ourselves. And I think in this process, we begin addressing the log that's hanging out of our own eye, instead of only looking at the specks in our Israeli and Palestinian neighbors' eyes. There's a lot that we need to see about ourselves. Nimrod Novik, who served as a foreign policy advisor to Shimon Peres, said in 1986 that the American Jewish community has not always been totally supportive of the Israeli positions. And really, the American Jewish community, in his estimation, was more useful to Israel on the questions of national self-interest. But he said, and this is writing to Peres, that the Israelis needed to promote, quote, the idea of the two-dimensional link between the U.S. and Israel. First, Israel's potential and actual contribution to American interests, the national interest argument, but secondly, and more importantly, the cultural, ideological, moral affinity between the U.S. and the State of Israel. So the political discourse regarding the State of Israel in the churches, broadly speaking, is filled with questions about this cultural, ideological, moral affinity. Historically, American religious impulses to support the State of Israel, whether emanating from Christian biblical interpretation or expressions of American civil religion, involve emphases of Israel's status as a natural ally of the United States against our shared threats, including communism, and especially since 9/11, Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, to use a phrase. So in the time that I'm going to present, before we break into 4 smaller groups for discussion and then coming back together to share what we've discussed, I want to address 4 topics that contribute to the shape of American foreign policy today. These topics of historical interest. First, the Western heritage of competition with Islam. Second, typological implications. And you'll hear what I mean a little bit more in that section. Third, American manifest destiny and American Indian removal. And fourth, U.S. suspicion of Arab perspectives. So those are the 4 pieces. And Doris is playing with the lights again. How do I look? All right. Yes, certainly. First, the Western heritage of competition with Islam. Second, the typological implications. Third, American manifest destiny and American Indian removal. And fourth, U.S. suspicion of Arab perspectives. So I'll begin with the Western heritage of competition with Islam. Now, when we think about that, is this better? All right, I'll get really close. When we think about the Western heritage of competition with Islam, very often we first think of the Crusades. But there's also a great deal in our Reformation heritage that informs current thought about how we approach the Islamic world. Popular American affinity for the State of Israel draws from a taproot of Puritan apocalyptic hope embedded within American identity and national vocation from the pre-revolutionary period to the present. Christian Zionism, which has come up in conversation today, which I define as political action informed by specifically Christian commitments to promote or preserve Jewish control over the geographic area now containing Israel and Palestine. is best understood as a political application of Anglo-American apocalyptic hope. Now, this peculiar form of apocalyptic interpretation is based in what I've identified as an Anglo-American Protestant tradition of Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation. This is a scriptural hermeneutic that was developed in the context of English Protestant polemics against both Catholicism and Islam. You need to remember that the Reformation was forged in what Lebanese scholar Nabil Matar has called the Turco-Catholic threat. I mean, even Luther said that the two horns of the Antichrist were the Pope and the Turk. And this follows through all of the European Reformations, not just the Lutherans. In England, the first full-length English language commentary in the book of Revelation was published in 1545. What was unique about that interpretation is that it includes a teaching of the national conversion of Jews to Protestant faith as an essential component of God's cosmic plan. That idea took hold in England. In 1596, Thomas Morton suggested that we cannot doubt but that the glory of God shall be wonderfully enlarged by the conversion of the Jews, and therefore it may be more desired than our own salvation. Thomas Brightman published Apocalypsis Apocalypsios, another full-length commentary on Revelation, in 1609. And he developed a central role for Jews in defeating the Turco-Catholic threat. He concluded, "Shall they return again to Jerusalem? There is nothing more sure. The prophets plainly confirm it and beat often upon it." But this was a military vision. As he says, after their conversion, Gog and Magog, that is, the Turk and the Tartar, with all the wicked Mohammedans, shall utterly perish by the sword of the converted and returned Jews. Again, that is 1609. And in 1627, finally, Joseph Meade, the most influential Puritan theologian whose influence was felt all through the Americas, wrote that the conversion and restoration of Israel will be synchronous with the destruction of the Turkish Empire. Both components of the future church, comprised of Gentiles and Jews after the conversion of Israel, will have its own peculiar enemy. The former, the Roman beast, with its uncircumcised origin, the latter, the Mohammedan Empire over a circumcised people, ominous to the descendants of Isaac. He is certain of the extermination of both, quote, to be accomplished at the coming of Christ. These ideas, as I said, were carried by the Puritans from England to the New World and were transferred almost unchanged. But there were some adaptations in the New World context. English Protestants, of course, had long identified Jews as significant for their eschatological expectation. And by the way, this is section 2, typological implications. Jewish national conversion and restoration to Palestine would confirm the truth of Puritan faith. That meant that Jews were imagined as an apocalyptic counterpart, an external ally in the present and future struggle against the enemies of Catholicism and Islam. Protestants in New England, on the other hand, applied the tradition into a sort of realized typology in which Jewish identity and purpose were brought into the core of American national identity. For certain apocalyptically conceived articulations of American identity, Jewish and American identities are fully entwined. For Anglo-American Protestants, Jews were less an external ally than a typological referent. This Jewish identity became part of American identity. With the founding of these United States, the tradition was transferred from religiously formed communities to the American state. And that meant that when Jews would organize during the 19th century toward the goal of establishing a nation state, traditionally Judeo-centric biblical interpretations and doctrines informed what many American Christians would recognize in the state of Israel, identifying Israel as a fellow worker for the redemption of humanity. For many Christians in the U.S., the State of Israel continues to not only be a political fait accompli, but a theological data point. The significance of the founding, continued existence, and expansion of the State of Israel has been broadly and deeply felt throughout American popular culture, especially among evangelical and fundamentalist Christians. The significance is still widely accepted by white traditionalist Protestants with deep policy implications. While the founding of the State of Israel has been celebrated by dispensationalists as a turning point in both human history and divine timing, for many Americans, the event yet again revolutionized the typological identification of American self-understanding with Israel's covenant with God. After 1948, the State of Israel has taken the place of the people of Israel as the typological referent within American Judeo-centric Christian thought. In the minds of American Christian Zionists, making no claims about Jewish understandings of the State of Israel, 1948 is a functional parallel to 1776, the dates when these two nations under God were manifested historically in order to realize their conjoined destinies. American evangelical and fundamentalist Christian recognition of the State of Israel echoes recognition of the same apocalyptic significance of the United States. This is how deeply felt the relationship to the State of Israel is in popular American Christianity. I'm going to take a little break here and say that one of the challenges that I've sought to face in the work I've done on the questions of Christian Zionism is to correct what I see as many liberals' easy dismissal of Christian Zionism, and the assumption that if we put forth the right argument, if we put forth the right ethical or humanist argument, that these affinities will fade away. That if we write just the right pamphlet, we'll be able to change some minds. And I've written a couple of those pamphlets. The fact is that this is so deep in our Anglo-American identity, it's fully entwined with our identity, that a good argument isn't going to solve it. We need something else, something deeper. I would propose that that something deeper is relationships. We need to develop the relationships, not make better arguments. But here I'm going to come to something even more difficult about us as Americans. And this is not just conservative Christians. It's not just the other. It's us as citizens of the United States. When I talk about American manifest destiny and Indian removal, the self-understanding of the United States as a chosen Redeemer nation was established by the English Puritan colonists in the early 17th century. Sailing on the Arabella toward his new assignment as the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop articulated one of the most enduring themes of American self-understanding. His model of Christian charity is responsible for describing the American project in the terms of Matthew 5:14, a city built on a hill that cannot be hid. Although this iconic image is drawn from Jesus' words, the prevailing logic of Winthrop's essay highlights the Deuteronomic strand of covenantal theology drawn from the Torah. It was natural to these Puritans that if they upheld their end of their covenant with God, they would be exceptional instruments for God's redemption of the world. The inevitability, therefore, of Anglo-Saxon territorial expansion was the foundation of U.S. policy toward American Indians. As our great American Joshua, George Washington, wrote in 1796, I believe scarcely anything short of a Chinese wall will restrain land jobbers in the encroachment of settlers upon Indian country. In an earlier letter, he wrote, the gradual extension of our settlements will as certainly cause the savage as the wolf to retire, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. American expansionism, including the specific phenomenon of manifest destiny, can be understood as a phenomenon of American national self-definition. As the boundaries of the U.S. expanded, the definition of what it meant to be an American narrowed. Should we be a country which condones owning slaves? Should Indians be assimilated into white American culture and granted citizenship equal to whites? Or should they be excluded and removed from predominantly white states, voluntarily or through force? In the 19th century, public discourse would retain Washington's sense of the inevitable decline of the Indian, but would more openly employ the language of ethnic cleansing and finally extermination. As California Governor Pete Burnett said in his State of the State address in 1851, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result with but painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power and wisdom of man to avert. Stephen Salaita, a young Palestinian American scholar in Virginia who studied with Robert Allen Warrior, an Osage Indian at University of Oklahoma, sees a fundamental connection between Palestinian and Native American experience. At one point in his study, Salaita offers a series of quotations in American and Israeli rhetoric regarding their respective indigenous populations. He counterposes, for instance, the 19th century U.S. military order to, quote, kill and scalp all, little and big, because nits make lice, with Avraham Stern's suggestion that Palestinians are, quote, beasts of the desert, not a legitimate people. Reflecting on the judgment of the savage imparted to American Indians for their resistance to colonization, Salaita reports Zev Jabotinsky's dictum that Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. These Zionist echoes of earlier American expansionist rhetoric, Salaita says, are not merely parallel, but confederated. Zionists drew inspiration from American history in colonizing Palestine, and American history also shaped the outlook of American leaders toward the Near East. More precisely, American colonists desired less to conquer the indigenous peoples they encountered than to possess the land they rightfully claimed as theirs. Reginald Horstman has observed that in the 1820s it was quite clear that Indian removal was not an effort to civilize the Indians under more favorable circumstances. Rather, it was an act to allow white Americans to occupy all the lands they wanted east of the Mississippi River. The settlers wanted all of the land and none of the Indians. In the same way, Israeli analyst Baruch Kimmerling has suggested that the only logical solutions to the Israeli crisis and paradox, the desire to possess the whole land of Israel without the Palestinian inhabitants, are to get rid of its unwanted population, or alternatively, to withdraw to the 1967 border. In other words, partial or complete ethnic cleansing. A newspaper in Kentucky supported the effort because the United States had obtained, quote, not the best boundary, but all the territory of value that we can get without taking the people. We've heard similar things today about Israeli policy. I want to just add one more quote here. You know, when the Balfour Declaration came in 1917, in 1922, the U.S. House of Representatives held several days of hearings on the establishment of a national home in Palestine. And early on in the debate, Representative Albert Rossdale of New York offered these comments. The resettling of Palestine has created a situation somewhat akin to that of the American colonist in his struggle with the American Indian. For like the early American settler on this continent, the Jewish colonist frequently has to till the soil with a rifle in one hand and a hoe in the other. The nomadic Arab raiders, on a smaller scale, are fighting the civilization of the Jewish settler as the Indian fought the American settler on this continent in the early days. The inescapable conclusion of these statements is that Palestinians, yet another alien people, must inevitably give way to the advancement of civilization in its Zionist form, just as American Indians had done for the United States, that the savages will be subdued as the desert is made to bloom by the rightful owners of the land. The House unanimously adopted the resolution in June 1922, while the Senate would adopt a similar resolution in June 1944. On to my last section here, suspicion of Arab perspectives. I want to talk specifically about the implications of that suspicion for relationships between Western and Arab Christians. As you know, Christians in Palestine, not all of whom are Palestinian Christians, are often perceived by U.S. Christians as exotic and arcane. There was an excellent book from the Baileys on this topic trying to introduce people to these communities. Palestinian Christians should be less concerned that Americans most often can't tell a Melkite from an Armenian than the fact that most Americans, Christian or not, are not aware that there are Christians indigenous to the land where Jesus lived, taught, and was crucified and resurrected. Most Americans simply do not know that Palestinian Christians exist. This basic lack of awareness means that in the U.S. context, Palestinian Christians are vulnerable to attempts to introduce potentially sympathetic audiences to their situation. Christian Palestinians have become the object of efforts to construct knowledge about their situation. And because the U.S. context is rife with ignorance concerning their realities, this knowledge can be constructed and disseminated by, on one hand, groups who are sympathetic to their plight but are generally unwilling to allow Palestinian Christians to speak for themselves, and on the other hand, groups who are openly hostile to the cause of Palestinian nationalism but who seek to build sympathy for their position through the vulnerability of a minority group. This trend is most harmful to Palestinian Christians when knowledge about them is constructed in order to discredit and politically delegitimize them. Paul Merkley, a Canadian Lutheran historian, complained in 2001 that even the Western churches of Jerusalem, where the local leaders are for the most part no longer Europeans but Arabs, no longer see themselves as defenders of what used to be called Christendom. Merkley and other Christian Zionists intentionally seek to drive a strategic wedge between Christian communities in Palestine and in North America. If Palestinian Christians cannot be understood as suffering under the yoke of Islamic oppression, they must be comprehended as having sided with Islam, and therefore as having forfeited North American Christian accompaniment and solidarity. These possible forms of engagement rely less on the actual witness of Palestinian Christians themselves than on politically useful constructions of the Islamic enemy. The Arab context is presumed by most Americans to be an Islamic context. For a variety of reasons, Christians in the Arab world are presumed to be the result of conversionary mission by Western Christians like you and me. There's little comprehension of Mitri Rahab's assertion that since Arab Christians and Muslims share the Arabic culture, history, and language, their fate is intertwined and inseparable, and that likewise Arab Christians are an inseparable part of the world of Islam. What most constructions of Palestinian Christian interests have in common is that they are a beleaguered minority oppressed by an outside force. Even among liberal Christians, such an approach can turn into a competition of condescension. As those narratives clash, and the question is usually who oppresses Palestinian Christians more, Jews or Muslims, one can sense either the dynamic of a football match with the Palestinian Christian community kicked from one team to another, or a rugby scrum in which the players are so focused on pushing back their opponents, the ball is left unattended on the pitch, more alone than it ever was before. when Western researchers and opinion makers take it upon themselves to develop narratives about Palestinian Christians, we risk losing the voice of the Palestinian Christian communities themselves, because we are so taken with the historic competition with Islam. At this point, I'd like to invite you to divide yourselves up into 4 groups. And I'll remind you of the topics, and it may be that all this is run together into one undiscernible mass, kind of like the mystery flavor of Dum Dum lollipops. Or you can divide yourselves into specific topics. Now, I'll remind you of those: the Western heritage of competition with Islam, the typological implications, American manifest destiny and Indian removal, and U.S. suspicion of Arab perspectives in relation to Palestinian Christians. And I invite you to take 15 minutes to divide into groups and discuss amongst yourselves, and we'll come back together and take some knowledge from this group of your reflection. One question.
Are your comments today?
As I was telling Doris earlier, this is kind of the distillation of 6 years of research. My book on these topics is currently with Oxford and is in the review process now. But I would be happy to develop this into an article that could be published on the CMEP website and in other places, if that would be helpful. So I do invite you to divide into groups. Kyle, Drew.
I think we gotta just divide us up, otherwise we'll spend all the time sorting ourselves out.
That's what I'm doing. So this is
Log that
Our manifest destiny is extended by supporting a Zionist state, that we as a United States, with God's blessing, are going to extend that destiny back into Israel-Palestine again. We also brought up a little bit about the issues of race and racism, partly because of American Indians, but also just because of how American cultural identity is so white-dominated in our own conception of whiteness. So that if we can kind of bring that to bear, it'll be helpful in some of our conversations tomorrow. And it might help us understand why, when we support Palestinian justice and peace, that we could be considered as anti-American, because we're actually subverting the manifest destiny ideology. Because we're supporting Palestinians, we're anti-American because we're anti-manifest destiny.
We sort of got off on a tangent about how Christianity sort of influences Israel, and then all of a sudden we realized we hadn't talked at all about Arab Christians. And so that led us into a discussion of how we really don't have a sense of solidarity on a Christian level with Arab Christians, and we didn't really come to any conclusions as to why that is. Whether that would be seen as anti-Semitic, or why, I think as Jared said, we place Arab Christians behind rather than beside either Jews or Western Christians.
We came up with a series of images. We were kind of rambling in our discussion, but I think these images are linked. One is these all have to do with the tradition of Christian destiny, and Europeans and English people thought of themselves as having a divine destiny. We talked about the city on the hill, Zion, as the name of the palace of King Henry VIII. And in the 1920s, when you commented on about these bills being passed in Congress, represented the 300th anniversary of Pilgrim settlement. Early European settlers in North America and New England were required to attend church and required to carry a gun with them to church. Popular beliefs in following the settlement and establishment of Israel was that early Zionists were pilgrims, settlers, and they fit into the American tradition. During the Crusades, when the European Christians reached Jerusalem, they killed most of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, regardless of what their religion was, because they couldn't distinguish, or they didn't even understand that there were Christians living there, and couldn't distinguish the Christians and the Muslims. St. Clare, befriended by St. Francis of Assisi, as defending the onslaught of the Turkish infidels by holding up the elements of communion, bread and wine. We're talking about the Muslim occupation of Spain, and in 1492 it was pointed out that, which was when Columbus set sail, that the Jews in Spain were driven out. We also commented about the image of early Israeli settlers, Zionists, being promoted by Leon Uris's novel, The Exodus, which is subsequently a film. Furthermore, the modern revival of, the current revival of concept of American exceptionalism.
Conversation. And we're coming close to the end of our time together. And I want to offer a couple of concluding comments. I know that what I presented to you is not easily digestible. This is the stuff that I've, like I said, I've been working on for quite some time. But it has helped me better comprehend the ways I believe our churches need to engage questions around Israel and Palestine. It is not just that evangelicals are simplistic and that they're being led around by a simple notion of commitment to the state of Israel. It is not simply a question of dispensationalism out of the 19th century, for instance, that the Left Behind novels are part of our American popular culture. And very specifically to the question of anti-Semitism, the formation of American foreign policy and religious support for current American foreign policy related to Israel and Palestine is not the result of Jewish contribution or manipulation. This is something that comes from deep within white Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity. Yes, Jews have come alongside those notions and have helped shape them in order to inform discourse around policy. Certainly they have. That goes back to Manasseh ben Israel's relationship with Oliver Cromwell. And that's a smart thing for them to do. But these ideas are not the result of Jewish contributions. These are something that emerge from within who we are as white, I'm seeing this room, as white Christians in the United States. So I hope that this pretty complex bit of information can better inform our conversation as we go forward to better comprehend the sources of why we act the way we act and the ways we should act to counteract, to be subversive in this world, so we can better serve all of those who seek peace with justice in Israel and Palestine, throughout the Middle East, and throughout the world. Thank you. Oh, do you want? Okay, Anne wants questions.
Anyone else want questions? Well, I'm interested in how this...
Well, how do we hold this Judeo-centric vision while being at the same time anti-Semitic? I mean, there are eruptions of anti-Semitism in American culture, and you think of American exceptionalism and destiny with the Ku Klux Klan, for instance. They have a vision for America as a redeemer nation in very peculiar ways, but at the same time explicitly anti-Semitic. Part of the dynamic of this tradition is that as the tradition was formed in its earliest expressions in England in the early 17th century, these ideas of Jews were being formed without any relationship at all to actual Jews, because Jews had been banished from England centuries before. So this was a construction of Jewish identity and vocation through a reading of the Bible. And so this Judeo-centric prophecy interpretation has absolutely nothing at all to do with philo-Semitism or with Jewish or concern for Jewish persons or communities. And so these two things, Judeo-centrism and anti-Semitism, can actually exist in the same space. Today, one of the things that I argue in my book manuscript, it's not yet a book, I know I'm not allowed to call it a book yet. In the manuscript, I argue that because we're dealing with abstractions, because we're dealing with Protestant Christian manipulations of Jewish identity, it isn't necessarily anti-Semitic, but it is certainly not philo-Semitic. It's certainly not of concern. It's not born out of concern for real Jews. And so there's a literary Jew who's of concern, but the real Jewish community is not the important thing. And you see that in the transfer that I mentioned of the importance of the people of Israel actually to the state of Israel, which is an abstraction, a reification. The people, Israel, are not so important. You see this in John Hagee and his writing. He's the founder of Christians United for Israel, where he talks about liberal Jews as cannon fodder for the Antichrist because they want to pull back from the occupation. So for him, the only real Jews are the Haredi Jews, the ones in black hats and coats. Those are the only real Jews. Those like Yitzhak Rabin deserve to be assassinated. So this is not a concern for Jews as Jews.
In this construct, you're talking about Israelis, not American Jews.
Which actually, I would say it's more the result of really is central.
Let me repeat your comment. Susan is suggesting that my comment that what we're seeing now is not so much the result of Jewish contribution or manipulation of U.S. perspective and policy isn't actually very accurate. She's pointing to the influence of AIPAC in the legislative process. And AIPAC is certainly influential. As you said, you came in a little later. The presentation was about the historical, cultural, and religious foundations of American identity through centuries, not just what's been happening since 1967, for instance. Although that's very important, and there is a very strong lobby that's ethnically based, that is very committed to tilting the balance in Israel's favor. The receptivity of those concepts in American culture could not have been created by that ethnically based lobby. There is a natural receptivity, an affinity within American cultural history that allows that to continue. And that's what I've been addressing in my presentation. And that the question of why we act the way we act is what I'm asking, not so much the question, why do they act the way they act? Well, the event of the Holocaust and how that contributes to the way we act. Oh, it certainly does. I mean, the Holocaust is part of our Western Christian responsiveness to Jewish people and to the eventual state of Israel. It certainly informs how we collectively act. However, the Holocaust, if I look at Christian Zionist discourse, the Holocaust is mentioned, but it's not dwelled upon. What's much more important in Christian Zionist discourse is the land grant to the people of Israel by God in Genesis 12:3. And so you have this reinforcement of a hermeneutic, a scriptural interpretation that comes that then is a process of reconfirming your entire worldview. So the Holocaust is discussed in Christian Zionist discourse, but it's not the central point. I would say that the contribution of post-Holocaust Christian-Jewish relations has had a much greater effect on liberal or progressive white Christians than it has on conservative or traditionalist Protestants in the United States. So we have been in those waters much more than our evangelical or fundamentalist sisters and brothers. I don't see any other hands. Thank you very much.